Assalamu alaikum and welcome to season 8 of BookBytes. It's been a fantastic break. And so we have a whopper to begin with. Tonight's guest is a well-known author, Razina Theba, who has become a household name since the launch of her award-winning memoir, A Home on Vorster Street. A memoir that may speak to and attribute to a particular family or extended family, but touches and draws on heartfelt memories for each of us. I have the pleasure of welcoming and introducing attorney and author Razina Theba with her award-winning, Sala award-winning, first-time published memoir. Welcome to the show, Razina. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam, Shafinaaz. Thanks for having me.
It was, so fantastic to have the opportunity to go through this book, and always the best time to go through it is fresh just before the interview. So I literally put this down just a couple of hours ago, and it's sitting in my heart. So the first thing I want to say to you is thank you for writing this book. I know it's a family memoir, it's your memoir, it's your story, but it resonates so deeply for all of us.
I'm glad to hear that. I mean, that's about the most popular feedback I'm getting, that I somehow seem to have spoken to a lot of families. I had no idea there was that much overlap, but it seems that there is. So I think people are, no matter what, people are essentially the same. Everyone who's raised in extended families have similar experiences. So I think, what I wrote about was that people were familiar with it. It was just nice to see it in a book, something that people could say that was my family as well. So that made sense.
I think, documenting your story, but social history is very much a sort of, a partnering kind of thing. And as much as this book is a tribute, it's also I imagine your form of activism, and so we'll get more into that, because when you talk about school days and you talk about currents like Auntie Farida, the Indian currents, and those universal kind of themes or people that bring out these themes really resonated. But at the same time, for me, the favorite and the central point of your memoir was this idea of going to Ma's house. Speak to us about your writing process and digging up those beautiful memories at your Ma's house.
You know what? The first chapter I've got to give the publisher credit for, because the very first, I think it's the chapter called A Home on Forster Street, was not part of the original manuscript. And they said to me, okay, this is lovely. We know it's about your family, but you've got to ground it in Ma's house. We don't know what Ma's house looks like. We don't know who lived there. So I wrote that chapter right at the end, just to allow the reader to create a setting, basically. And that's why I introduced all the characters. I explained, the way we were raised, the type of yard we were raised in, what outdoor toilets were like, the kind of food that we ate, the idea of the son and the daughter-in-law living with the in-laws. So that chapter was particularly, it was done very consciously, unlike the other chapters. So Ma's house was, of course, Ma was my nanny, and it's where everyone congregated. It's just, I have the most wonderful memories of being there, of particular food, of particular celebrations. And I think my cousins all feel the same way. It was just a particularly nurturing environment for all of us.
And as much as it is about getting cousins and family together and having these moments of experimentation and adventure and getting out of trouble or getting into trouble, I'm not sure which is more. This idea that you could converge on a place that was a safe place, that you felt safe, and that, it might not have been your parents' home, but all the cousins seem to, I love that idea. I think that is the ultimate resonance for a lot of families. Your tribute to the past. How important was legacy making, legacy writing for you in this process?
Well, the thing is, this book was written for my sons. I'd never pictured myself as a writer. It's not what I do. It just seemed like a really good idea, and the stories kept adding up. And I thought this would be a stunning thing to leave to them when they're 21, 22, or even later. I'll get it bound, and it'll be a really lovely thing for the family to have. but then as I started writing more and more, it became less about my kids and more about me, because it was a way that I could process everything that happened in my life. And that I share these experiences I share with so many people from my generation. So in a very mindful way, I wanted to tackle my schooling. I wanted to tackle what the people in my family, the odds they kind of fought against in order to do better for their children. So I'd like for it. I mean, it's not a very romantic story. She kind of wrote this for her kids, and then it went to a publisher. But I didn't, start out thinking this is going to be a book. It was just my experiences, things that were important to me. The chapter I wrote on my son Aman was very important to me because I wanted him to know what I was like when he was born. So I had half a manuscript, and I sent it to a few publishers, and then they were very specific about the gaps. They said to me, "Look, there's a few things you need to work on," and so the second half of the book was written very mindfully. The first half was written very recklessly, to be honest with you. It's just people I love, people who kind of influenced my thinking, people I think about all the time, people who have sort of formed my personality, lessons I've learned from some of them. And as you know, now that you've read the book, some of them have passed on. And it didn't feel to me like that's the end of who they are, because they live on in so many of us, and my kids know peculiar things about me. And if they ever asked me, why are you like this? I'd tell them why I'm like this. So they're teenagers. They don't sit for long enough for me to tell them. So I thought if I put it in a book, it's sort of a physical copy, that they can look at whenever they want to.
I think creativity can be very reckless, and that's where the beauty emerges. I hope you've affirmed for yourself enough that, you've so successfully created this memoir that you are indeed a writer or a storyteller of your own, of your own stories, and the way you've reflectively presented these stories for your family, but a social document for the rest of us, the communities that will read through this as well. You also touch on grief and loss. As much as your stories are so evocative, and there's beauty and there's fun and there's time for laughter, but there's also time for pain. I want to pay tribute to two of your cousins that you mentioned without getting into it, because they were those stories were so impactful. It told me as a reader what you felt and how they impacted on your life. So I want to pay tribute to your cousins Shamma and Zunaid and their life stories, and I hope that readers will engage these stories because they're so powerful.
Yeah. So some of the stories were written sort of at the beginning of COVID. That's when I was finalizing the memoir. And I think a lot of us are reeling with loss and shock and pain and disbelief. And for me, this was a sort of, in a sense, I felt like, in my own family, we were losing people. And it felt the enormity of what was happening in this world. And I thought, I wanted to write about these cousins of mine because they're physically gone, but their lives were not meaningless in a sense. Both of them, things happened to them when I was much younger, but it was almost a reassurance to people who are losing their loved ones that they are not gone, because they do live on in all of us. It's sort of the ways in which I'm influenced by almost everyone around me. I believe this, and I say this in my acknowledgements, that I'm the sum total. The way I think, my thought processes, the way I move through this world is a result of everyone I've been with, who's raised me, who's kind of, and I don't take everything from everyone, but we get to pick and choose, and some things are just more impactful than others. So these two cousins I chose to write about because it was kind of in that period. As COVID was hitting and as we were losing people, that people are never forgotten, even when they pass on.
Absolutely, and so beautifully written in tribute of them. There's so many aspects that you touch on, wedding protocols, for example, in various ways, and I love how Ma's house is the sort of container for all these things that happen. And these observations that you make from a very young age. You're a very observant 6-year-old, and you're processing life, as it were. The wedding protocols that we've all heard of what's right is right, or how things are done, or how you're invited, and how that affects your isn't, and whether you're able to. So speak to us about how you basically laid out this toolbox of protocols, and in the story in such beautiful ways. Give us some of your examples, and you're
Yeah,
processing, I think, through the story, but I love how you can reach back to 6-year-old you and make sense of this.
yeah. My book does say I was raised in a shopping mall. So, I mean, a lot of my time was just spent watching people. That's what I did for hours every day. And I think it developed an ability to look at a person and be able to describe to my head what they're doing, what they're thinking, or nuance of the way they move, or how they relate to people, or I'd watch two people talk and look at their faces, and I can tell you whether they're enjoying being with each other or not. So I think it was many years of sort of trawling around the Oriental Plaza, looking, watching. And then, what I wanted to do is be true to myself. So the story about my wedding is actually very much my lived experience, of not wanting the fanfare, not wanting all the hoopla, and kind of going with it and what happens to me. Also, I look at two generations after me, the 20-year-olds getting married, and how much of sort of how things have changed. And I often say, oh gosh, we had no input, into. My parents said, hey, we're paying for it. You'll do it the way we want it done. So I think people enjoy it because I put in little reminders of what life used to be, and what kind of sort of reminds me every day are my own children, because I watch how they move through this world. I watch the confidence with which they move through this world, and it's not my experience at all. Of course, they're fortunate, and it is a different world they're living in. But I needed to put these things down, I think, for myself more than anything. And we've all got those wedding videos. I don't know, some people still have it on VHS or Beta or whatever, It was ridiculous, but it was funny, and it was homely, and it's what we remember. I was a bit nervous about, the appeal of this kind of a thing. I didn't know whether it would resonate with anyone, really. Was this just my experience? Are people thinking, what is she writing about? So I had to, there was a fair amount of anxiety, as you can imagine, writing this memoir. And because it's set in Fordsburg, and because so many people have come through Fordsburg or Newtown or Fitas, and I needed to get it right, because I felt that responsibility that I'm not writing for a generation, but there's a generation that knows the area well. And there was no way I could wing this. It had to be absolutely true to my experience. And working with a really great publisher, double-checked everything I said was helpful,
I think it's so important to have a good editor and somebody who can maintain your voice as a writer while carrying on, to do the thing that they're meant to do, which is shape and perfect it. But you create your stories and you write with so much of empathy that is, I think, your main element here, is that these are your stories, but you're writing with empathy and you're reaching out in so many ways through your stories. You spoke about the plaza, and there's so many things there, like, preparing for Eid. And we were of those small town children that came to the plaza to look for Eid clothes and bumped into people from other towns, or families in Johannesburg. And so all of those, just the vivid smells, sounds, tastes of the plaza are all just there in your writing. You said you were a plaza baby, so you got to know everyone that was everywhere, and you seem to be everyone's baby.
Yeah.
Your memories are just, written so beautifully. Talk to us about growing up in the plaza and the sights and sounds of it, because we quickly want to say that what's important about this writing for this generation that you've said, or not really writing for a generation, is Fordsburg hasn't been frozen in time. Fordsburg has changed so much, but you've captured something very important about a time, a space, and a place, and that's what makes this memoir so powerful for the rest of us. So a little bit more about the plaza, Commissioner Street, Paan, those memories that are no longer there.
Yeah. Um, I touch on all my childhood experiences. I had to sit and think quietly to myself, what are the standouts in my head? People have said to me, you haven't written about Ackle's food. I do give it a cursory mention. Of course, there are things I've left out there. It would be an encyclopedia if I included every single memory. But the ones that were the most powerful, the December Commissioner Street, sort of wearing shorts and feeling so hot and going out in the evenings, and the absolute excitement of being taken to watch dancing fountains. If I sit quietly and I close my eyes and I think about that moment, I can feel it and I can see it. And that's kind of how I write. I write with less thinking, and it's a more sort of visceral process, where I can almost see my cousins around me. The minute I try and do something very fancy and, get up at 9 a.m. and sit near a window and the very romantic style of what the writers do, it never works out. It's just a very heavy, miserable story. But there are times where, for example, I describe how my cousin's bangles would work from her wrist to her elbow. And that was somebody I saw in Checkers who was sort of unpacking her trolley, and I was watching her bangles. And I thought, wow, those bangles must be getting so tired in the evening because they're working from wrist to elbow. So I kind of weaved observations and things I feel and see about people into the stories. I didn't know if it was going to work. Let me tell you that. I didn't know if adding that much Gujarati was it going to work? But again, I worked with people who said, we will keep it the way you write it. We will not shift it. We'll leave all the Gujarati. The readers will figure it out. So I was grateful for those kinds of nuances, and I think as a result of that, the book had a broader appeal because at my age, I speak and understand Gujarati, and I imagine lots of people from the area do. So when the characters spoke, they couldn't all speak in English. It just wouldn't make sense to me. So a simple line like "ine nochere," people laugh at that because we don't hear that a lot anymore. So I just wanted it to be real.
Yeah. Mums don't admonish their children in Gujarati anymore.
No, my kids would give me the blank expression, "What are you saying, Mum?" So it resonates with, I think, people who are spoken to in Gujarati. It's words that we haven't heard in a long time. And as all our grandparents are passing, our parents don't speak to us in it anymore. I think it was particular for that time. We were like third generation South Africans, and yeah, it made sense at the time. But for my memoir, it needed to be there. It was what I wanted more than anything. So I think if I found a publisher who said, no, we're not going to allow that, I would have been very hesitant to give this book away.
And some things just can't be translated. It can only be said in that particular way because it carries so much of emotion beyond just the meaning of that vernacular.
Yeah, and I think it's important for everyone to be able to see themselves in a book, to be able to identify. I've often said to my children, it wasn't until I was much older that I read stories with brown and black characters. Other than that, all we aspired to be were Sweet Valley High teenagers, blonde and blue-eyed and living in California. That was never going to happen. So as a child, I couldn't find books that wrote about people like me, which is why in Standard 6, when I read Ahmed Esup's The Haji and Other Stories, I was so excited because there were characters with names like mine and living in communities like mine. So it's important that, everyone writes stuff that people can identify with.
You carry such, I actually giggled a lot through this book as well because your phrases and idioms like you're in skits, Murray biscuits. I don't know when last I've heard that. Possibly 30 or 40 years ago.
Yes.
So, Your classroom situation, just so vivid, but also, like I said, a form of activism aside from paying tribute and collecting this memory. So much happens in the classroom space that we didn't have the terminology for at the time. Speak to us about your chapter on humiliation and how, how children just processed classroom life that would be unacceptable today.
Absolutely. When my kids read that, they said, "Wow, you allowed all of that." It doesn't. It still happens for sure. Probably with less frequency, and I don't know. I don't know if any parents would allow that to slide. But those were my experiences. You are attaching some activism to it, but every single thing there happened. But the thing is, it impacted on me quite dramatically. For a very long time, I was uncomfortable about speaking in public. I kept thinking, just keep a low profile, you won't get yourself into trouble. And the ways it formed my own identity. At Wits, by then you've got many years of teachers telling you you're stupid. So you're not entirely sure. You think you may not be stupid, but you're not entirely sure, So you then get to university, and unfortunately, some of these things you carry with you. So this was sort of, a lot of my book was therapy. It was therapeutic for me to put it down on paper and say, this happened to me. And I know it happened to so many people as well. So I think it's how we process things, by writing about them, by making sense of them. And there isn't a story that I wrote where I knew what was going to happen from start to finish. It kind of, I started writing, and then where my thoughts went is what I wrote about. And then I remembered, wow, in grade 1, that teacher hit you on your knuckles. And then in standard 10, that biology teacher swore at you, and as you're writing these stories, these ideas come to you. So the stories were written fairly quickly. I'd do a story in one sitting, but then I'd be very unhappy with it and then go interfere with it many times. But the actual story was true to life. So in a sense, my job was easier because I knew what happened. It was just a matter of getting it at the right tone, and evoking the right kind of emotion in the reader to say, this is what I went through. But on the other hand, I had some fantastic teachers, and I named them, who were a very positive influence, who kept on reassuring us that, you know what, you're going to be okay. You know enough to go to university. I think people underestimate the kind of humiliation. It depends. Some people kind of fought through it, broke through it, and rose above it. I struggled a bit at university with so many years of schooling that could have been better, that could have been more effective, that could have prepared me better for the world.
They often say that the words you hear when you're growing up become your inner voice, and it's a struggle against deciding your own capacity beyond that.
Yes, yes, yeah, absolutely. And that's what the chapter was about, that I mentioned, that humiliation does one of two things. Either, your life lands up in a crumbled heap, or you find a way to break through. And people are people. Not everyone's going to react in the same way. I can tell you it did take me a long time to process a lot of those things. I less readily put my hand up and volunteer information, because I remember that 6-year-old putting a hand up and saying, I can write my name, and getting beaten up for it.
I never did understand that. Why did she get wrapped, or why did you get wrapped over the knuckles for writing your name?
Because when I wrote the letter A, I don't know if you remember this, they tell you round up and down. And when I went around, the line on the top didn't join with the circle. It was some absolutely random thing like that.
Let's quickly chat about Auntie Farida, because there are Auntie Faridas in every generation across the board. She's the, quintessential Indian Karen. She's always got her say, unsolicited information, advice, and a very important part of this, the latter aspect of your story.
Yeah. Well, she's a real person, believe it or not. I did embellish here and there. She doesn't know it's about her. It's distant family. But, I couldn't write a memoir without writing a character like hers. Every single family has one. People know, they can identify who she is. And I think in my family, because we are so many women, all my uncles and aunties had daughters. There were very few sort of boy cousins. I needed to write to sort of somebody who thought my family was poorer for having so many females. I wanted to write to what the mindset was about that. And as you know, I had an aunt who kind of smashed the glass ceiling for all of us. So becoming a doctor in the 1960s as a female, we were never raised thinking we were less than because we were female. So when this idea was introduced to us, it was quite surprising actually. So I needed to write to a character like Farida, and also as a Muslim person, I mean, I'm well aware of the kind of stuff we are told, which is completely untrue, about what Allah thinks about being educated, about having boys in the family. And I wanted to deconstruct a lot of those kinds of things. So yeah, I created Auntie Farida. Vile Auntie Farida.
Auntie Farida with her duas for male children, like you said, I thought her arrogance was just, but believable because, yes, as you say, we do come across women who probably self-regulate, but want to regulate everyone else's lives as well. But in subtle ways, it does come through in your, when you put on your wedding dress, for example, and in well-meaning ways, cousins and aunties are like, not exactly like Farida, but they like sort of, but this might not work so well, or it might not be right, or it won't look right. Your words,
Yes,
it won't look
yes,
right.
yes, absolutely. I mean, in a lot of spaces, my generation, I don't have daughters, I have sons, but a lot of my friends have daughters. And you'd think that they don't uphold the patriarchy as much as they really do. Because I watch them calling their daughters to set the tables while the sons are watching TV. And that's happening in 2023. They kind of subscribe these stereotypical roles to daughters in this day and age. Maybe I was lucky in that there were no boys around. So whether it was changing the light bulb or setting the table, you did it all. There was no let the boy do that. There was no boy around to do that. So I don't know about that. But I do find, even my generation, huge amounts of my friends and people I know who just treat their girls so differently. Putting down a plate and a glass on a table, I can't understand how a girl can do it better than a boy could. But it happens. It happened when I was a kid. It still happens. I get told all the time that, that profession's good for a girl, that profession's not good for a boy, and, vice versa. I don't understand all of that. So I needed to write a character where she was so absurd and so ridiculous that, it makes us question how we're still raising kids and the things we are saying to them.
And in some ways, I think, yes. In some ways, I think we do have this internal dialogue that is passed down, the regulatory behaviors that are passed down, and we gaslight. People gaslight each other just to maintain that status quo. And so we need to maybe, conversations like this and through your book, need to help us to deconstruct this idea and not just choose a gendered way, but follow the sunnah. As simple as that, We want to really demystify this process. It is about following the sunnah. Razina, we have run out of time, but I've been absolutely delighted to have this chat with you, to read your book. And I know that it's going to continue to fly off the shelves because everyone needs to read this book as far as I'm concerned. Congratulations on the award, the first time published award at Sala last year. It's definitely more than validation for the amazing work you've done with this memoir, and we wish you everything of the best with the book and with anything in your future that you write.
Thank you, Shafinaaz. Really kind things you're saying to me. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks.
Absolutely. All the best and every success. And with that, that's this evening's edition of Book Bites. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.